Between 1982 and 1985, Belgium was confronted by a series of crimes that seemed, at first, to belong to the familiar world of armed robbery. A stolen weapon. A stolen car. A shop entered after dark. A supermarket held up near closing time. These were not unknown events in Europe in the early 1980s. But as the months passed, the pattern became harder to explain, and the violence became harder to contain within any ordinary idea of theft. The group became known in Dutch as the Bende van Nijvel, and in French as Les Tueurs du Brabant. In English, they are usually called the Brabant Killers. By the time the attack stopped, 28 people were dead, including children, and many more had been wounded. No one has ever been convicted. The case remains one of Belgium's largest unsolved criminal investigations. It is remembered not only for the number of victims, but for the empty space at the center of it. Again and again, the money taken was small. The risks were enormous. The shootings were often excessive, even when no one seemed to be blocking the attacker's escape. That imbalance has shaped the investigation ever since. In the early 1980s, Belgium was a small country with a complicated interior life. Brussels sat near its center, both national capital and international city, with European institutions, embassies, offices, and quiet residential districts spreading outward into the surrounding province of Brabant. But beyond the surface of government buildings and commuter roads, Belgium was divided by language, by region, by political culture, and by overlapping police authorities. Dutch-speaking Flanders lay to the north, French-speaking Wallonia to the south, and Brussels existed between them, officially bilingual and often politically tense. Brabant, as it existed then, surrounded Brussels and stretched across towns that could feel suburban in one direction and rural in another. Roads connected small communities quickly. A person could leave a supermarket car park, pass through wooded lanes, cross a municipal boundary, and be under the responsibility of a different police service within minutes. For ordinary people, this was simply how the country worked. For investigators, it would become one of the many obstacles in a case that never stayed neatly inside one jurisdiction. The landscape of the crimes was not dramatic in the way people might expect from organized violence. These were not remote hideouts or military targets. They were supermarkets, garages, restaurants, arms shops, roads, and car parks. Places where lights stayed on into the evening. Places where families stopped for groceries, where workers locked up, where night watchmen made their rounds, where a taxi driver picked up a fare and expected to go home. At first, the crimes appeared to be separate incidents. A burglary here, a stolen vehicle there, a violent robbery somewhere else. Only later would investigators and journalists begin to see them as parts of a possible sequence. Even then, the shape of the sequence was uncertain. Some events are firmly attributed to the Brabant killers. Others are treated as possible precursors, related by weapons, vehicles, method, or later investigative theory. The file grew not as a straight line, but as a tangle. One of the earliest events sometimes linked to the case occurred on December 31, 1981, in Etterbeek, when a gendarmerie barracks was burgled. Weapons, ammunition, and a car were stolen. It is often described with caution, as a precursor rather than a confirmed Brabant killers attack, but it became part of the larger landscape. It mattered because later crimes would also involve stolen weapons and stolen vehicles, and because investigators would repeatedly return to the question of whether the attackers had military or police knowledge. On March 13, 1982, in Dinant, a long-barreled shotgun was stolen from a gun shop. At the time, it could have been just another weapons theft. In May, armed car thefts followed, including the theft of an Austin Allegro and a Volkswagen Santana. These were still fragments. Belgium did not yet have a name for the men behind them. There was no single public fear, no national shorthand, no myth of three masked figures. There were only reports, statements, vehicle descriptions, and weapons entering circulation. Then, on August 14, 1982, the violence crossed briefly into France. In Maubeuge, close to the Belgian border, a grocery store was robbed. Food and wine were taken. The loot was almost ordinary, the kind of goods one might associate with opportunistic criminals rather than an organized campaign. But when two French police officers arrived, they were shot and seriously wounded. This was one of the first moments when the contradiction became visible. The value of what had been taken was small. The willingness to shoot was not. The next major attack came on September 30, 1982, in Wavre, at the Decay's arms shop. This was different from stealing food or a car. The target itself was a source of weapons, and the attackers took multiple firearms, including submachine guns. During the attack, a police officer was killed, and others were wounded. From that point, investigators were no longer dealing only with robbers who might carry guns. They were dealing with men who were actively increasing their firepower. The Decay's robbery also deepened another question. Were these criminals improvising, or were they building towards something? The stolen weapons could be used in later attacks. The confrontation with police showed a readiness to kill. And the choice of target suggested that the group understood the value of certain equipment beyond ordinary resale. On December 23, 1982, in Beercel, a restaurant was entered. Small value items were taken. The caretaker was killed. Records described the killing as brutal, and the financial gain as minimal. Here again, the case presented its central contradiction in plain form. A person died, and the material reward appeared almost meaningless by comparison. It was the kind of crime that made investigators ask whether robbery was the motive, or only the outward shape. The year 1983 brought a wider and more recognizable pattern. On January 9, taxi driver Constantin Angelou was murdered. His car was later found in Mons. Taxi drivers are vulnerable in a particular way. They work at night, carry cash, and accept strangers into their cars. But the later discovery of the vehicle folded the murder into the broader pattern of stolen transport, movement, and escape. On February 11, 1983, a Delhaize supermarket in the Genval area was robbed. Several people were wounded, but no one was killed. Delhaize was a familiar name in Belgium, a place associated with errands and household routines. A supermarket robbery could be frightening, but still understood as criminal greed. Yet by this point, the shootings around the crimes were becoming impossible to dismiss as panic. On March 3, at a Colruyt supermarket in Halle, the pattern sharpened further. During the robbery, a staff member was killed. The attackers were now repeatedly entering everyday commercial spaces and bringing extreme violence with them. They were not only stealing. They were leaving behind dead and wounded people in places where the public had never expected to encounter this kind of force. By September 1983, the violence escalated again. On September 10, in Thames, a textile factory was raided. Bulletproof vests were stolen. The night watchman was killed, and his wife was badly wounded. The theft of body armor mattered. It suggested planning, and an interest in equipment that would protect the attackers in future confrontations. Cash could be spent. Food could be consumed. But bulletproof vests were tools. 1 week later, on September 17, came the attack at Nivelles. Members of the group targeted a Colruyt store. Jacques Faurez and Elise de Witt, a couple who had stopped nearby, were killed. Gendarme Marcel Mora was also killed when police responded, and another gendarme was wounded. The scene at Nivelles became part of the public memory of the case because it was not simply a robbery that turned bad inside a store. It included movement outside, the arrival of people who had no reason to believe they were entering danger, and the lethal response to police intervention. The violence did not seem measured to the practical needs of escape. It seemed larger than that. On October 2, in O'Hain, a restaurant owner was killed. Little or nothing was stolen. 5 days later, a Delhaize and beer cell was robbed, and a man associated with the store was killed. On December 1, in Anderloos, a jewelry shop was attacked. The owner and his wife were killed, and only a small amount of jewelry was taken. By the end of 1983, the file contained murders, robberies, stolen weapons, stolen cars, supermarkets, restaurants, an arms shop, a textile factory, and a jewelry store. A dead police officer, dead shopkeepers, dead workers, and wounded survivors. Signs of planning and signs of chaos. Crimes that looked ordinary from a distance and deeply strange when examined closely. Then the attack stopped, at least publicly, for 1984. There was no known major Brabant killers attack that year. The silence did not tell investigators whether the group had broken apart, gone to prison, left the country, changed members, or simply waited. It did not reveal whether the violence had been criminal, political, personal, or some combination that only made sense to the men involved. The absence became another piece of the mystery. For the public, time can soften fear, but it can also deepen it. When nothing happens, people begin to hope that whatever passed through their lives has disappeared. But investigators cannot treat silence as proof. Weapons may still exist. Witness memories may fade. And somewhere, if the attackers were still alive, they had learned from everything that had happened before. When the attacks resumed in 1985, they did so with a new level of terror. The final phase centered on Delhaize supermarkets, and the effect was immediate. These were not obscure targets. They were places where families shopped in the evening, where children sat in cars, where people bought bread, meat, household goods, and weekend groceries. The violence entered one of the most ordinary parts of Belgian life. On September 27, 1985, the first attack came at Braine-l'Alleud. Men entered the Delhaize supermarket. Witnesses described armed attackers, masks or disguises, and sudden, indiscriminate shooting. 3 people were killed, Roger Engelbien, Ghislain Platan, and Bozider Jurovsky Sr. Others were wounded. The amount taken was modest. It is important to pause here and reground the shape of the case, because the details can begin to blur. By this point, the attacks had been going on, with interruptions, for several years. The confirmed and suspected events included stolen cars, stolen guns, shootings of police, attacks on shops, and murders where the financial gain was very small. The men had not been identified. They had been seen in masks and disguises. Witnesses had described height, movement, weapons, and vehicles, but never enough to solve the case. And now, after a quiet year, they had returned to the place most associated with routine. Soon after the Braine-l'Alleud attack, on the same evening, another Delhaize was attacked in Overijse. 5 people were killed. Among them was banker Lyon Finn, whose death later became part of several theories because of his professional background. Those theories remain disputed. Legally, the Overijse attack remains part of the same Unsolved series, a violent supermarket robbery, a small financial return, and a high human cost. The 2 attacks on one evening intensified the fear. It suggested mobility, coordination, and a willingness to strike again before the shock of the first scene had even settled. For police, this meant the attackers could move quickly between towns. For ordinary people, it meant that danger did not stay where it had first appeared. After the September attacks, security was increased around supermarkets. Patrols were more alert. The public was more aware. Stores were no longer just commercial spaces, they were potential targets. Yet increased awareness did not prevent the final attack. On November 9, 1985, the Delhaize supermarket on Parkland in Ulst was attacked. It became the deadliest event in the series. 8 people were killed. Among them were Gilbert van de Steen, his wife Therese, and their daughter Rebecca. Their son David survived, seriously injured. The family had gone to the supermarket as a family. That ordinary fact remains one of the most painful details in the case. Witnesses described attackers who did not behave like ordinary robbers focused only on speed and escape. They fired on customers and bystanders. They remained at the scene longer than expected. People were shot in and around the car park. The terror was not confined to a cash register or a doorway. It spread across the space where people had parked their cars and expected to return home. Ulst also produced one of the enduring questions about the end of the series. Police officer Eddie Nevins reported firing at one of the fleeing men. Later theories suggested that one of the attackers may have been wounded during the escape and may have died soon afterward. This has never been proven. No confirmed body was tied to the group. But the idea remains because after Ulst, the Brabant killers disappeared. No confirmed attack followed. The violence stopped as suddenly as it had resumed. There was no public claim of responsibility. No trial. No explanation. The final image left behind was not an arrest, but a car leaving, shots fired, victims on the ground, and investigators entering a silence that would last for decades. The men seen during the attacks were often reduced, in police reconstructions and public memory, to 3 figures. These names were not identities. They were working descriptions, a way to organize witness accounts. The first was called the Giant. Witnesses described a tall man, sometimes seeming to direct events or move with authority. Height is memorable in moments of fear, but fear also distorts memory. Still, the Giant became one of the most recognizable figures in the case, a shadow with no confirmed name. The second was called the Killer. Witnesses described a man who fired with little hesitation and seemed responsible for some of the most direct violence. In a case already marked by excess, the idea of one especially violent shooter became central to how people imagined the group. The third was called the Old Man, described as older or middle-aged, often associated with driving or support. He appeared less dominant in public memory, but support roles matter. Drivers choose routes, wait under pressure, handle vehicles, and determine whether the attackers escape or are trapped. Witnesses described masks, disguises, and sometimes face paint. The group used stolen cars, often Volkswagens, sometimes modified or burned. Getaway routes seemed planned. They appeared, at times, to understand police response patterns. But none of that proved who they were. The investigation itself became part of the story. In the early years, the case was divided among jurisdictions and police services. Belgium's law enforcement structure was fragmented. The gendarmerie, judicial police, and local police did not always communicate smoothly. Rivalries existed. Language divisions complicated paperwork and trust. Evidence from one district did not always move cleanly into the hands of another. Later attempts were made to centralize the file, but by then the case was already large, damaged, and difficult to control. Records and reporting have described mistakes and missed opportunities. Vehicles connected to the attackers were not always preserved. Items with possible fingerprints were reportedly lost. Evidence was mishandled, misread, or disputed. Leads were followed intensely and then abandoned. In one early suspect line involving a group referred to as the Borains, statements and ballistic evidence became controversial. The line ultimately collapsed, leaving behind not a solution, but further distrust. One of the most important evidence discoveries came in November 1986, in the Brussels-Charleroi Canal near Ronquiers. Weapons, parts of weapons, bulletproof vests, and other items were recovered from the water. Here were physical objects, tangible remains of the crimes, pulled from a canal where someone had tried to make them disappear. But the Ronquiers discovery became one of the case's great controversies. Later analysis raised questions about how long the items had been in the water. If they had been there since 1985, they could be read as discarded evidence from the killers themselves. If they had been placed there later, then someone may have interfered with the investigation. Some former investigators rejected claims of manipulation. Others believed the file had been steered or contaminated. The canal evidence did not solve the case. It deepened doubts. Who put the items there? When? And if someone knew where they were, why had that knowledge not led to the killers? Over the decades, many suspect names entered the public record. Each has to be treated carefully. Being named in an investigation, a newspaper article, or a parliamentary inquiry is not the same as being found guilty. Philippe de Sterck, a known criminal, was investigated but not convicted. Madani Bahush and Robert Beyer, former gendarmes, were repeatedly discussed in theories because of their backgrounds and alleged access to weapons. No court established their involvement. Patrick Hemers, a well-known Belgian criminal, was sometimes mentioned because of his height and violent profile. No proof established it. Jean-Marie Tink was arrested in 2014 and later released without charges. Christian Bonkowski became a focus after his brother reported a deathbed confession to being the giant. Forensic comparisons reportedly did not confirm that claim. Other theories focused on far-right groups, especially Westland New Post, and possible links to a strategy of destabilization. These theories grew from the political climate of the time, from fears about extremist networks, and from the strange mismatch between the violence and the financial reward. Parliamentary inquiries examined these connections. They were documented, discussed, and investigated. They were not established in court. This is one of the hardest parts of the case to hold clearly. The crime seemed too extreme to be simple robbery, but that does not automatically prove a hidden political operation. The police failure seems serious, but that does not automatically prove a cover-up. The case invites theory because the facts leave so much empty space. But the empty space is not evidence by itself. Modern investigators used tools unavailable in the 1980s. DNA samples were collected and compared. Fingerprints were checked again. Bodies were exhumed. Composite sketches were reissued. Thousands of tips were examined. Old statements were revisited. People who had been young witnesses became middle-aged and older witnesses. Still, the file did not produce charges that led to convictions. In 2024, Belgian law changed. The crimes were made imprescriptible, they could no longer become time-barred. The change was widely understood as being shaped by this case. It meant that if evidence emerged, prosecution would still be legally possible. But legal possibility is not the same as a suspect. It does not restore lost evidence. It does not sharpen every memory. It only keeps the door open. In June 2024, Belgian federal prosecutors informed survivors and relatives that the investigation had effectively reached the end of available leads. Thousands of witness tips had been examined. Hundreds of DNA samples had been analyzed. Thousands of fingerprints had been checked. Dozens of exhumations had been carried out. The case had not been solved. In 2025, reporting indicated that a court accepted requests for additional witness hearings linked to Ulst. Two brothers, children at the time, had reportedly seen suspicious movement after the November 9, 1985 attack and had noted a license plate. The information had entered the file but had not been properly followed up at the time. Those steps did not solve the case. But they showed that the file was not entirely closed. Even after decades, a forgotten detail can surface. A missed witness can matter. A license plate written down by children can return as a question for a court. The confirmed facts remain simple and heavy. 28 people were killed in the series attributed to the Brabant killers. No one has been convicted. The crimes involved stolen weapons, stolen vehicles, supermarket attacks, and a pattern of violence far beyond the money taken. Investigators examined criminal, political, police, and far-right connections. The killers have never been legally identified. The Brabant killer's case endures because it sits between the ordinary and the unthinkable. The targets were everyday places. The victims were people doing ordinary things, working, driving, buying food, standing in a car park, waiting to go home. The crimes entered daily life and left behind a national wound. After November 9, 1985, the attackers vanished from the record. The evidence remained. The theories grew. The files expanded. Witnesses aged. Investigators retired. Laws changed. Families continued to ask for the same thing they had asked for from the beginning, the names of the people responsible, and the reason it happened. And after all these years, the quiet question remains. If the money was never enough to explain the violence, what was? On the evening of September 15, 1981, a 10-year-old girl named Ursula Herrmann disappeared near the Ammersee in Bavaria. She had been riding her bicycle home from Skondorf to Esching, a short journey she knew well, through a lakeside landscape of small roads, trees, fields, and familiar village paths. She never reached her house. The distance was not great. In ordinary life, it was the kind of distance a child could cross without anyone imagining danger. The Ammersee lay quiet nearby, one of the lakes southwest of Munich, bordered by villages that still carried the rhythm of rural Bavaria in the early 1980s. There were wooded stretches, gravel paths, farm buildings, church towers, and houses where people knew one another by sight. Children moved between nearby villages for school, sports, music lessons, family visits, and errands. A bicycle ride from Skondorf back to Esching belonged to that ordinary world. But that evening, somewhere along the route, Ursula vanished. Her bicycle was found that same night, lying away from the path in the undergrowth. Ursula was not with it. For almost 3 weeks, police, family members, firefighters, volunteers, and search teams looked for her. Then, on October 4, 1981, investigators found a wooden box buried beneath the earth in the Weingarten area between Skondorf and Esching. Inside was Ursula. The case became one of Germany's most widely known child abduction investigations. For decades, no one was convicted. Then, nearly 30 years later, a man named Werner Mazurek was found guilty of extortionate kidnapping resulting in death. The conviction is legally final. But the case has never fully settled in the public mind, because the evidence was circumstantial, because some of it was later challenged, and because people close to the case continue to ask whether every part of the story had truly been answered. To return to the beginning, it helps to slow the evening down. Esching am Ammersee in 1981 was not a place built around anonymity. It was close enough to Munich to be connected to the larger world, but still shaped by village life and the landscape around the lake. September in Bavaria can still hold warmth from the day, but by evening the air begins to cool. Shadows lengthen under the trees. The lake grows darker before the sky does. Small roads that feel harmless at noon can become quieter at dusk. Ursula Herrmann lived in Esching with her family. She was the youngest of 4 children. Her older brother Michael would later become one of the most important public voices in the case, not because he sought attention, but because he remained troubled by the evidence and by the official conclusion. Long after the trial was over, he continued to ask whether the case had been fully solved. On Tuesday, September 15, Ursula had lived through what began as a normal school day. After school, she spent time at home. She practiced piano with her older brother. Later, she rode her bicycle to Skondorf for gymnastics. After gymnastics, she visited relatives in Skondorf. Around 7:20 in the evening, her family called and told her it was time to come home. The ride back to Esching usually took about 10 minutes. So the facts at that moment were simple. Ursula was 10 years old. She was in Skondorf. Her family was waiting for her in Esching. She left on her bicycle and began a short ride through a familiar area near the Ammersee. It was still light enough to travel, but evening was coming on. When she did not arrive, concern came quickly. Her family began looking. Relatives and neighbors joined. Police and firefighters were called. The search began in the most natural way, by checking the route she should have taken. That night, the wooded area between Skondorf and Esching became the center of attention. Searchers moved along the paths and into the undergrowth. They called her name. The darkness made everything slower. A forest that is familiar by day can become difficult to read at night. Every bush and ditch has to be checked. Every sound has to be separated from the noise of people searching. A sniffer dog led searchers away from the path into the undergrowth. There, not far from the route Ursula should have taken, they found her red bicycle. Lying off the path. A missing child might be delayed. A missing child whose bicycle has been found abandoned in the woods is something else. But Ursula was not nearby. The search continued through the night and into the days that followed. The lake had to be considered. The woods had to be searched again and again. In the first hours, every possibility had urgency. Then the case took another form. Ursula's parents began receiving strange telephone calls. The caller did not speak in a normal way. Instead, the calls included a recorded radio jingle from Bayern 3. The recording seemed to be part of a system, a way for the kidnappers to make contact while avoiding a direct voice that could be recognized. Then came the letters. Made from cut-out letters, assembled in the familiar style of ransom notes. The demand was for 2 million Deutsche Marks. The Herrmann family did not have that kind of money, but they indicated they would try to comply. The ransom communication suggested that Ursula might still be alive. The family had to act as though she could be saved. Police had to treat the matter as an active kidnapping. This is one of the hardest facts to hold in the case. According to later findings, Ursula was already dead by the time the ransom demand was being pursued. Her family was receiving instructions, waiting for contact, and trying to respond, while the child at the center of the demand was already beyond rescue. The hiding place had been prepared before the abduction. It was not improvised in panic after something went wrong. It was a wooden chamber, placed beneath the forest floor in the Weingarten area between Skondorf and Esching. The site was close enough to Ursula's route to fit the abduction, but concealed well enough that searchers did not find it for 19 days. The forest above it looked ordinary. Earth, branches, natural material, and small trees helped disguise the disturbed ground. For days, searchers passed through the area without finding the box. In woodland, the surface is uneven by nature. Roots, fallen leaves, moss, and brush can hide small differences. Searchers can walk only a short distance from something and still miss it, especially if it has been carefully covered. As the days went on, the search became more methodical. Investigators began probing the forest floor with metal rods, looking for hollow spaces, disturbed earth, or something solid beneath the surface. A rod pushed into earth may strike a root, a stone, or nothing at all. Searchers had to decide what felt natural and what did not. On October 4, 1981, 19 days after Ursula disappeared, searchers found something solid below the surface. Beneath the earth was a wooden box. A chamber built into the ground and hidden from view. The box is generally described as around 139 to 140 centimeters high, about 72 centimeters wide, and about 60 centimeters deep. It was large enough for a child to be placed inside, but not large enough for comfort. Inside, investigators found Ursula. The box contained features that showed planning. There was a seat or bench. There was lighting powered by a battery. There was a radio tuned to Bayern 3. There were supplies, water, soft drinks, chocolate, biscuits, chewing gum, comics and novels. A toilet bucket. A jogging suit in a plastic bag. These details suggested that whoever built the chamber intended, at least in theory, to keep Ursula alive while ransom negotiations took place. But the central design failed. The chamber had a plastic pipe system meant to allow air to enter and leave. Investigators and later courts concluded that the system did not work. Without active ventilation, there was not enough air exchange. The box became a sealed space. Ursula died of oxygen deprivation. Investigators concluded she died within hours, possibly sooner. The supplies inside the box had not been used. Food and drink remained untouched. Some investigators believed she may have been unconscious after being placed inside. So the broad facts are these. Ursula left Skondorf for home on the evening of September 15. She was taken before she reached Esching. Her bicycle was found that night. Ransom communications followed. A buried wooden chamber was discovered on October 4. Inside it were supplies that suggested planning, and an air system that failed. Ursula had died long before she was found. The original investigation was large, intense, and difficult. Police looked for someone with local knowledge, because the site had not been chosen at random. They looked for technical ability, because the box included lighting, a battery, a radio, and an attempted ventilation system. They looked for someone who might have needed money badly enough to demand 2 million Deutsche Marks. Werner Mazurek became a suspect early. At the time, he lived in the area near the Herrmann family. He was described as technically skilled, especially with electronics and audio equipment. He also had financial problems, which prosecutors would later treat as a possible motive. Mazurek's background became important because the crime had several layers of planning. The offender had to prepare the wooden chamber, transport materials into the forest, dig the hole, install features inside, conceal the structure, abduct a child, and manage ransom communications. This suggested patience, practical competence, and a willingness to experiment with devices and recordings. He was questioned in 1982, but he was released. Suspicion was not proof. He gave an alibi, and investigators did not have decisive forensic evidence linking him to the crime. There were no fingerprints from the box that conclusively identified him. No DNA evidence. The investigation remained active, but the case did not yet have enough to support a charge. Another important figure was Klaus Pfaffinger, an acquaintance of Mazurek. Pfaffinger reportedly told police that Mazurek had asked him to dig a hole in the forest, and that he had seen a box. If reliable, this statement was powerful. It placed Mazurek near the preparation of a buried chamber before the discovery of Ursula's body. But Pfaffinger recanted. He later withdrew what he had said. In criminal investigations, a recanted statement can still matter, but it becomes harder to use. Was the first statement true and the recantation an attempt to retreat? Or was it exaggerated or pressured? The problem became even more serious because Pfaffinger died in 1992. By the time the case came to trial, he could not be questioned in court. The breakthrough came many years later through renewed cold case work. By the 2000s, investigators returned to the ransom call audio. The recorded Bayern 3 jingle had always stood out. It was strange, impersonal, and deliberate. But recordings can carry traces that are not obvious to ordinary listeners. A tape recorder can leave small mechanical signatures, its speed may vary slightly, its tape heads aligned in a particular way, frequencies altered or distorted. These patterns can sometimes be compared. In 2007, investigators searched Werner Mazurek's home in Kappeln, Schleswig-Holstein, and seized a Grundig TK-248 tape recorder. Prosecutors later argued that this machine was connected to the ransom call recordings from 1981. The analysis was not a simple match. It was not a fingerprint or a DNA profile. It was an audio and phonetic comparison. A Bavarian LK expert examined the sound characteristics. The prosecution argued that technical abnormalities in the Grundig machine corresponded with features heard in the recorded Bayern 3 jingle. In the prosecution's view, this made it probable that the recorder had been used in preparing the ransom call material. This became one of the most important and most controversial parts of the case. Audio evidence of this kind asks a court to trust specialized interpretation. The expert is comparing patterns, distortions, and irregularities. When the evidence is decades old, the questions become even more delicate. Mazurek denied involvement. He said he had purchased the tape recorder shortly before the search. The prosecution combined the tape recorder evidence with other factors: his financial situation in 1981, his technical skills, his local knowledge, the old statement from Pfaffinger, and monitored conversations that prosecutors believed showed awareness consistent with guilt. In May 2008, Werner Mazurek and his wife, Gabriele Mazurek, were arrested. More than 26 years had passed since Ursula disappeared. The case that had once seemed frozen in time was moving toward trial. The trial began in February 2009 at the Augsburg Regional Court, lasting 55 trial days. Nearly 3 decades had passed. The court had to look backward through imperfect memories, missing witnesses, physical evidence that had not produced a direct identification, and expert conclusions about sound recordings. There was no conclusive fingerprint from the box. No DNA trace tying Mazurek to the chamber. The case was entirely circumstantial. The question was whether the pieces, taken together, formed a reliable conclusion beyond reasonable doubt. On March 25, 2010, the court convicted Werner Mazurek of extortionate kidnapping resulting in death. He was sentenced to life imprisonment. Gabriele Mazurek was acquitted. In January 2011, Germany's Federal Court of Justice upheld the conviction. From that point, it was final. But the final legal judgment did not end public unease. Mazurek continued to deny guilt. Later media investigations and outside experts raised questions about the strength of the tape recorder analysis. Specialists associated with the University of Zurich were reported to have questioned aspects of the original phonetic and audio comparison. The challenge concerned method, interpretation, and the degree of certainty that could fairly be drawn from old recordings and a seized machine. Those challenges did not overturn the conviction. But they became part of the continuing record. For some observers, the tape recorder remained a persuasive technical clue. For others, it was too uncertain to carry the weight placed on it. Michael Herrmann, Ursula's brother, also expressed doubts. Over time, he came to believe that the official conclusion had not fully answered the case. He pursued legal efforts aimed at reopening questions around the investigation. Those efforts did not succeed. The conviction remained final. In June 2023, after about 15 years in custody, Werner Mazurek was released from prison on parole. The conviction remained unchanged. No alternative offender had been charged. No retrial had been granted. The careful way to tell this case is to keep returning to the firm facts without pretending that every uncertainty has disappeared. Ursula Herrmann vanished on September 15, 1981, during a short bicycle ride from Skondorf to Esching. Her bicycle was found that night. Her family received ransom communications demanding 2 million Deutsche Marks. On October 4, searchers found a buried wooden box in the forest. Ursula was inside. The chamber had been prepared in advance and stocked with supplies, but the air system failed. She died of oxygen deprivation. Those facts are not in dispute. The dispute lies in the question of responsibility. A court concluded that Werner Mazurek was responsible, and that conclusion is final in law. At the same time, the evidence was circumstantial, and serious questions have been raised by people who studied the case, reported on it, or lived with its consequences. There is also the question of whether the crime was committed by one person or more than one. The construction of the box, the digging of the hole, the concealment, the abduction, and the ransom communications all suggest a level of effort that has led many people to wonder about accomplices. No other person has been convicted. The possibility of unknown involvement remains one of the shadows around the case. A case can be closed by a court and still remain difficult to carry. It can have a final judgment and still leave people asking whether every expert conclusion was sound, every lead was followed, and every person involved was identified. Ursula Herrmann was 10 years old. On that September day, she went to school, practiced piano, attended gymnastics, visited family, and set out for home. The case that followed lasted decades. But at its center remains that short ride near the Ammersee, through a wooded stretch between two villages. And the question that still rests uneasily beside the legal record, what, if anything, is still unknown about the night Ursula disappeared. In June of 2009, a man arrived in Sligo, on the west coast of Ireland, carrying very little that could be used to explain who he was. He came into the town quietly, the way many travelers do, with a bag over his shoulder, another piece of luggage with him, and enough money in cash to pay for a short stay. At a hotel desk, he gave a name. He gave an address in Austria. He did not show identification, and he was not asked for any. For 3 days, he moved through Sligo in a pattern that would later seem careful, almost ritualized. He appeared on CCTV. He spoke only when he needed to. And little by little, he removed the last practical traces of himself. On the morning of Tuesday, the 16th of June, his body was found on the beach at Ross's Point, a few miles from Sligo town, where the land opens out toward the Atlantic. The post-mortem would rule out foul play. This was not, in the legal sense, a murder inquiry. But it became something more difficult to close, a death with no confirmed identity, no known family, no verified past, and no one who could say with certainty what name he had carried before he arrived. The name he left behind was Peter Bergmann. Investigators established that it was false. The address he gave was false as well. More than a decade later, after CCTV reviews, forensic checks, public appeals, and international inquiries, the man known as Peter Bergmann remains unidentified. Sligo in June is not an unusual place for a stranger to pass through. It is a coastal town in the northwest of Ireland, set between mountains, river, and sea. The Garavogue River runs through the town. Benbulben rises to the north, wide and flat-topped against the sky. On damp days, the air can feel silvered by mist. On clearer evenings, the light holds late over the Atlantic, lingering on the edges of buildings and pavements before fading. In summer, there are more visitors than usual. A man checking into a hotel with limited luggage would not immediately stand out. He might be a tourist passing through. He might be traveling onward the next morning. The fact that he was quiet would not make him suspicious. Many people are quiet when they travel. Ross's Point lies a short distance from Sligo town, where the land narrows toward the sea. The Atlantic there does not need drama to feel present. It is there in the wind, in the salt on the air, in the dull rush and drag of waves moving over sand. Even in June, even in good weather, it can feel remote once evening comes down and the day visitors begin to leave. It is the kind of place where a person can stand looking out across the bay and be visible, but still private. In June 2009, it was also the place where the final known hours of an unidentified man would be traced. The first confirmed stage of his journey begins in Derry, in Northern Ireland, on Friday, the 12th of June. He boarded a bus bound for Sligo. He was not described as agitated. He did not draw attention to himself. He was another passenger taking a seat, moving south and west through the border country toward the Atlantic side of Ireland. He arrived at Sligo bus station at about 6:28 in the evening. From there, he took a taxi into the town centre. Witness descriptions would later place him in his late 50s or 60s, about 5 feet 10 inches tall, slim, with grey hair and blue eyes. People who heard him speak described a German or Austrian accent. He was neatly dressed. He gave the impression of someone orderly and controlled. The first hotel he tried was reportedly full. He then went to the Sligo City Hotel on Quay Street, and there he booked a room for 3 nights. At the hotel desk, he gave the name Peter Bergmann and wrote down an address, Einstedtersen 15, 4472, Vienna, Austria. He was not asked for identification. He paid in cash. There was no passport number, no driver's license, no official record attached to the booking. Only later would those details become significant. Investigators checked the Austrian address and established that it did not exist as given. The postal code did not correspond to Vienna. The address did not lead to a home, a workplace, or a person who could identify him. The name did not lead to a confirmed match either. The information had the appearance of a record, but not the function of one. It gave investigators something to follow, and then it led them nowhere. On Saturday, the 13th of June, the pattern that would later define the case began to appear on CCTV. The man left the Sligo City Hotel carrying a purple plastic carrier bag. The bag appeared full. When he returned, he no longer appeared to be carrying its contents. Then, later, he left again. This happened repeatedly. During his short stay he left the hotel 13 times carrying a full plastic bag, and each time came back without anything visible. The exact contents were never identified. The footage did not show a dramatic act. It showed a man passing through public spaces with an ordinary-looking bag. The camera saw him in fragments, entering a frame, crossing a lobby, moving along a street, leaving the range of the lens. It showed that he went out carrying something and came back without it. But it did not show what was inside the bag. It did not show where those contents went. Investigators later believed he was disposing of personal belongings in stages. Whatever he discarded was not recovered. The CCTV is both central and limited. It allows investigators and viewers to follow the last days of a man who otherwise erased himself. And yet it stops short of explanation. It does not tell us whether the discarded items included identification, medication, letters, photographs, travel documents, or personal notes. It does not tell us whether he was calm inside his own mind, only that his movements appeared controlled from the outside. Saturday also brought one of the more curious details of the case. He went to the post office and bought stamps and airmail stickers. He purchased postage suitable for mail leaving Ireland. This opens many questions that cannot be answered with confidence. If he bought stamps, did he post letters? If he posted letters, who were they for? Were they confessions, farewells, instructions, apologies, or practical arrangements? Or did he buy the stamps and then never use them? No confirmed recipient has ever been identified. No letter has been publicly traced back to him. If he sent letters, their contents may have been the only direct explanation he left. But if those letters arrived, they were either not recognized, not preserved, not reported, or not connected publicly to the man at Ross's Point. It is useful to pause here and reground the known facts. By the end of Saturday, the man had arrived in Sligo from Derry, checked into the Sligo City Hotel under a false name, given a false Austrian address, paid in cash, and begun making repeated trips out of the hotel carrying a purple plastic bag that appeared full when he left and empty when he returned. He had also purchased stamps and airmail stickers. He was visible, but he was not becoming known. He was leaving a trail of movement without leaving a trail of identity. On Sunday, the 14th of June, he turned his attention toward Ross's Point. He took a taxi from Sligo and asked to be brought to a beach. The driver took him to Ross's Point. The road from Sligo toward Ross's Point is short, but the atmosphere changes as the town falls back. Buildings thin out. The air opens. The land lowers toward the bay. Grey-blue water, shifting light, wind moving across open ground. The beach could feel inviting or austere. It could be a place for walking, swimming, and looking outward. It could also be a place where a person could stand near the edge of things without interruption. When he arrived, he did not remain there for long. He looked at the area, and returned to Sligo in the same taxi. What can be said is this: he visited Ross's Point on Sunday, the day before he would return there for the last time. He asked to see a beach. He was taken there. He did not stay. He went back to town. The Sunday trip established that he knew where the beach was. He had seen the place before spending his last known evening there. Why he chose that particular stretch of coast remains unknown. It may have appealed to him because it was quiet and accessible. Or it may have held a private meaning that no one has uncovered. On Monday, the 15th of June, he checked out of the Sligo City Hotel shortly after 1 in the afternoon. Whatever had remained in his room did not reveal who he was. Whatever he had carried with him when he arrived had been reduced to almost nothing useful. At the bus station, he was seen with scraps of paper or notes. He took them from his pocket, read them, tore them up, and placed the pieces into a bin. Their content is unknown. A man reads papers, tears them up, and throws them away. The action is common enough. But in this case, the scraps might have contained a final route, a name, a medical note, a drafted message, or nothing more than ordinary travel information. They were lost before anyone understood the significance of the man disposing of them. At about 2:20 in the afternoon, he took a bus to Ross's Point. This time, unlike the Sunday trip, he stayed. During the afternoon and evening, multiple witnesses saw him in the Ross's Point area. Some remembered him because he seemed slightly out of place for the beach. He was not dressed like a casual swimmer. One witness later said that if someone were going swimming, you would usually know it. This man looked more like someone on business. Witnesses described him as calm or even pleasant in passing. He was seen on the beach. He greeted people. He remained there for hours. He was not invisible. He was present in the world right up to the end. People looked at him. People heard him speak. But none of them knew who he was, and he gave them no reason to ask. The final reported sighting of him alive came around 11:50 that night. He was walking near the ocean, carrying a plastic bag. High tide was expected within about half an hour. In June, on the west coast of Ireland, the light lingers late, and even after sunset there can be a long dimness over the water. But by midnight, the beach would have been quieter. The day's visitors gone. The sound of the tide more present. The wind cooler. On the morning of Tuesday, the 16th of June, Arthur Kinsella and his son Brian were at Ross's Point. Brian was training for a triathlon. As they moved along the beach, they found the body of a man. Gardaí were called. The post-mortem ruled out foul play. Although the body had been found at the beach, the post-mortem did not support classic saltwater drowning. The cause of death is widely reported as cardiac arrest or heart attack. The medical examination also found serious underlying illness. He had heart disease and evidence of previous heart attacks. He had advanced prostate cancer, with cancer that had spread to the bones and lungs. There was no evidence of common painkillers or opiate-based medication in his system, despite the likely pain caused by the disease. This changes the emotional shape of the case. Here was a man who was seriously ill, possibly terminally ill, and apparently traveling without the medications many people would expect someone in his condition to have. Whether he refused treatment, had stopped taking medication, or had disposed of it before death is not known. But the illness was real, and it was severe. Items found near the rocks included black leather Finn comfort shoes, dark socks, a black leather jacket, navy chino trousers, a black sleeveless jumper, and a leather belt. The labels had been removed from his clothing. He also had distinctive dental work, including a gold tooth. No dentist has publicly identified him, and no dental record match has resolved the case. Once Gardai began working backward from the body, the name Peter Bergmann quickly failed. Investigators reconstructed the last known days through CCTV footage, witness statements, hotel records, taxi accounts, and the bus journey. In one sense, they knew a great deal about the final 72 hours. In another sense, they knew almost nothing. They did not know his real name, where he had lived, whether he had family, or why he chose Sligo. Police searched for matches through DNA, fingerprints, dental records, and international inquiries. No missing person report matched him. Gardai have said that no one has ever come forward to say this could be their father, brother, cousin, husband, neighbor, patient, or friend. The absence may be part of his plan. He may have been estranged from family. He may have lived alone. He may have come from a community where his disappearance was never formally reported. All of these remain possibilities. None is confirmed. What he left behind is almost defined by absence. No wallet. No passport. No phone. No document that led back to a home. The clothing remained, but the labels were gone. The body remained, but the name did not. The most supported interpretation is that the man deliberately arranged an anonymous death. He used a false name and false address. He paid in cash. He removed labels from clothing. He disposed of belongings. He carried no identification. He visited Ross's Point before returning there. He was seriously ill. Foul play was ruled out. This interpretation does not answer every question. It does not explain why he chose Sligo. It does not explain the stamps. It does not explain whether the name Peter Bergmann had private meaning, or whether it was only a convenient alias. Other theories have circulated. Some have suggested he was a former intelligence officer, pointing to his careful removal of evidence. But none of those details require professional training. Others have imagined a fugitive or criminal connection. But there is no verified criminal history because there is no verified identity at all. The medical findings support a more grounded possibility, a man near the end of serious illness who wanted control over the circumstances of his death. Gardai renewed their appeal in 2021. The man discovered at Ross's Point had never been identified and was buried in an unmarked grave in Sligo Cemetery. Locate International later renewed public attention, asking people in Germany, Austria, and elsewhere to consider whether they recognized his face, his dental work, his clothing, or the false address he wrote at the hotel. The appeal also asked whether anyone had received a letter from Sligo in June 2009. The case became known more widely through the documentary The Last Days of Peter Bergmann. The film brought the quiet strangeness of the case to a larger audience. But it did not solve the case. No confirmed identity has been announced. No family has stepped forward. No letter has been traced. The man remains buried under the name he chose, even though investigators believe that name was not his. He was seen at bus stations, in a hotel lobby, at a post office, on town streets, in a taxi, and by the water at Ross's Point. For 3 days, he existed in public view. He was a man with grey hair and blue eyes, a German or Austrian accent, serious illness in his body, and a careful route through a coastal Irish town. And yet the part of him that would have made recognition possible had already been removed. What remains is a name that was not his, an address that led nowhere, a set of belongings without labels, and a grave in Sligo. The question left behind is not only why he died there, beside the Atlantic, after 3 quiet days in town. It is who had been walking through the world before he became Peter Bergmann. In West London, between February 1964 and February 1965, 6 women were found dead in a series that became known as the Hammersmith Nude murders. Their names were Hannah Tailford, Irene Lockwood, Helen Barthélemy, Mary Fleming, Frances Brown, and Bridget O'Hara. They were found across a relatively small part of the city, near the Thames and the streets that ran out from it, Hammersmith, Chiswick, Brentford, Kensington, and Acton. The case was investigated by Scotland Yard, followed closely by the press, and examined again decades later. But no one was convicted. The person responsible was never formally identified. The murders remain unsolved. To understand the case, it helps to begin with the place. West London in the early 1960s was not only the image later remembered in photographs of fashion, music, and new money. Along the river and behind the larger roads, there were older working communities, narrow streets, industrial yards, garages, railway arches, small factories, car workshops, storage depots, and stretches of open land that changed character after dark. By day, the area could feel ordinary and active. But at night, the same places became quieter. A towpath that had seemed familiar in daylight could feel exposed under weak lamps. A yard gate, a railway line, a dark wall, or the rear of an industrial building could create a pocket of silence inside the city. The Thames was central to the geography of the case. It moved through Hammersmith and Chiswick, past bridges, warehouses, moorings, and patches of foreshore. The river was both a landmark and a problem. It could disturb evidence, carry objects away, and make it difficult to establish where a body had first entered the water. Tides altered the scene. What was found on the foreshore might have been left there, or might have been moved there by the river itself. The women who were killed lived within this West London world. They had come from different parts of Britain and Ireland. Some were mothers. Some were pregnant. Some had moved to London looking for work, independence, or escape. Their lives had brought them into vulnerable situations, but vulnerability was not their identity. Each had a history before the case, before the police files, before the newspaper language that narrowed them into victims. The press quickly gave the unidentified killer a name, Jack the Stripper. It was a reference to Jack the Ripper, and to the fact that the victims were found without clothing. Behind that label were 6 real women, and a year of fear in the streets and river margins of West London. The first accepted victim in the series was Hannah Tailford. Hannah was 30 years old. She was a mother, and some accounts state that she was pregnant when she died. She had come from the north of England and lived close to the edge of financial security. She moved through a city where some women could disappear for a time before anyone in authority fully understood the danger they were in. On February 2, 1964, Hannah's body was found on the Thames foreshore close to Hammersmith Bridge. Investigators documented that Hannah had been strangled. She was found nude. Several of her teeth were missing. Her underwear had been placed in her mouth. These details would later seem part of a pattern, but at that first stage the pattern was not yet visible. Police had to ask basic questions. Had Hannah been killed where she was found, or moved there? What did the absence of clothing mean? There were no immediate answers. Hannah Tailford's death entered the files as a grave crime, but not yet as the beginning of one of Britain's most difficult unsolved murder investigations. That changed in April. Irene Lockwood was 25 or 26 years old. She was also pregnant. She had come from Nottinghamshire and was young, far from the places where she had begun, and part of a London that often judged women like her more quickly than it protected them. On April 8, 1964, Irene's body was found on the foreshore of the Thames at Corney Reach, Chiswick, not far from where Hannah Tailford had been found. Investigators documented that Irene had been found naked and had been strangled. The similarities were now difficult to ignore. Two women, both found near the Thames in West London. Both undressed. Both killed by strangulation. Police began to consider that the deaths were connected. A single murder calls for one type of investigation. A possible series changes the scale, the urgency, and the fear. Only 16 days after Irene Lockwood was found, there was another discovery. Helen Barthélemy was 22 years old. She was Scottish-born, from East Lothian. She had come south to London while still very young, joining the movement of people who entered the capital in search of a different life. On April 24, 1964, Helen's body was found in an alleyway in Brentford. This time, the body was not on the foreshore. It was on land, away from the immediate riverbank. That change was important. The killer was not dependent on the Thames. Bodies could be moved by vehicle and left in streets, alleys, or other dark places. Investigators documented that Helen had been stripped and killed by strangulation or asphyxiation. Her front teeth were missing. But her case also gave police one of the most important pieces of physical evidence in the entire investigation. Tiny flecks of industrial paint were found on her body. The paint flecks mattered because they were specific. They suggested contact with a place where paint spray was present, a workshop, garage, factory, or storage area. A small particle could link a body not only to a killer, but to a place. Helen Barthélemy's death shifted the investigation from a series of similar scenes toward a search for an environment. The fourth accepted victim was Mary Fleming. Mary was 30 years old. She was Scottish-born. Some accounts describe her as a mother of four. That fact changes the emotional shape of the case. Mary's death did not end only one life in isolation. It created absence in the lives of children, relatives, and people who had known her before London reduced her to a name in a murder file. On July 14, 1964, Mary's body was found outside a house on Berrymead Road, Chiswick. A residential setting. The killer was not only using remote riverbanks or industrial edges. He was willing to enter streets where people lived behind curtains, where a car engine might be heard. Investigators documented that Mary was found unclothed and had been strangled. Her front teeth were missing. Paint flecks were again found on her body. Neighbors reported hearing a vehicle reversing shortly before the body was discovered. That detail became part of the practical picture police were building. The killer had access to a vehicle. The bodies were being transported. A driver had to stop, move a body, and leave without being clearly seen. That pointed to someone with nerve, knowledge of quiet streets, or confidence that he would not be challenged. Police began to think in terms of routes. Which roads connected Hammersmith, Chiswick, Brentford, Kensington, and Acton? Which industrial sites had paint spray? Which men had access to those sites and also to a vehicle? The investigation widened, but each lead had limits. A paint particle could suggest a type of place, not a face. The fifth accepted victim was Frances Brown. Frances was 21 years old and Scottish-born. She had testified during the Stephen Ward trial associated with the Profumo affair. That connection made her more recognizable to the press, but it risked turning her into a symbol of scandal rather than a person. She was a young woman trying to live inside a city that could be dazzling in one district and indifferent in the next. Frances was last seen alive on October 23, 1964, getting into a client's car. A witness later gave police a description of the man and the vehicle, often reported as a gray Ford Zephyr or Ford Zodiac. For investigators, this was the kind of lead they had been waiting for, a possible moment of contact between a woman and the man who may have killed her. On November 25, 1964, Frances Brown's body was found in a car park in Kensington. Investigators documented that she had been strangled and stripped, with the same pattern of missing teeth and paint flecks. An identikit image was produced. But a gray Ford was not rare enough to narrow the case by itself. The witness had seen a moment, not the crime. It is worth pausing here and returning to the fixed facts. By late 1964, 5 women had been found dead in West London. All had been stripped or found nude. Most had been strangled. Several had missing teeth. Industrial paint flecks had appeared on more than one body. The geography was tight enough to suggest local knowledge, but wide enough to frustrate simple surveillance. The police were not chasing a legend. They were trying to identify a man who used real roads, real vehicles, real yards, real shadows, and real opportunities. The city itself was part of his cover. The final accepted victim was Bridget O'Hara, known as Bridie. Bridget was 27 or 28 years old and an Irish immigrant. She had come to London from Ireland, one of many who crossed the water to find work and a different future. She was reported missing after January 11, 1965. More than a month passed before her body was found. That interval is significant. It meant that someone had either concealed her body for a time, or left it in a place where it remained undiscovered. Police had to think not only about killing and disposal, but about storage. On February 16, 1965, Bridget O'Hara's body was found near a storage shed behind the Herrmann trading estate in Acton. She had been strangled. She was found nude. Her teeth were missing, and paint flecks were found on her body. Her condition suggested storage in a warm environment. The Herrmann trading estate now became central to the investigation. An electrical transformer at the estate drew attention because of the heat associated with it. Paint spraying facilities in the area were examined. Investigators looked at floors, walls, and workshops where spray residue might settle. It suggested that the person responsible may have had access to the estate, may have worked there, or may simply have known how to enter and leave without being questioned. The investigation became one of the largest Scotland Yard inquiries of its era. Some accounts state that almost 7,000 suspects were questioned and around 120,000 statements taken. Detective Chief Superintendent John Dew Rose led the inquiry. His team used plainclothes patrols, decoy operations with women police officers, and watched roads at night. Dew Rose also used the press as a tool. After the paint evidence pointed toward the Herrmann trading estate, he publicly claimed police had narrowed the suspect pool, first to around 20 men, then 10, then 3. The strategy was partly psychological. Dew Rose believed the killer would be following the news, and he wanted to unsettle him. No further accepted Hammersmith nude murders occurred after Bridget O'Hara. Whether the killer was frightened off, died, moved away, or stopped for other reasons remains unknown. The man most strongly associated with Dew Rose's later account was Mungo Ireland. Mungo Ireland was Scottish-born and married, reportedly living in Putney with his wife and children. He had worked as a security guard at the Herrmann trading estate. A security guard could know the rhythms of an industrial estate, which gates were used, which areas were poorly lit, where a vehicle could be left, when workers came and went, and which corners were warm, empty, or unobserved. He might have legitimate reasons to be present at unusual hours. Ireland became linked in later accounts to Dew Rose's unnamed suspect, referred to as Big John, described as a respectable married man in his 40s. Later writers and researchers identified this man as Mungo Ireland. But it remains important to separate suspicion from legal fact. In March 1965, Ireland died by suicide from carbon monoxide poisoning in a garage. He left a note saying, "I can't stick it any longer." Because his death came after police had publicly suggested the suspect pool was narrowing, some interpreted it as meaningful. But Ireland was never arrested, charged, or tried. No court heard evidence against him. A major dispute concerns whether Ireland could have been present for the final murder. Some records suggest he was in Scotland when Bridget O'Hara disappeared. If correct, that would weaken the case against him significantly. Later review material reportedly argued the work records placing him in Scotland may have been falsified. That remains disputed. Rose later acknowledged that because the man he believed responsible was never arrested or tried, he had to be considered innocent in law. Another man, Kenneth Archibald, walked into a police station in April 1964 and confessed to the murder of Irene Lockwood. He was charged and brought to the Old Bailey. In court, he retracted his confession. There was no supporting evidence. He was acquitted. Decades later, another name became prominent, Harold Jones. Harold Jones was a convicted Welsh child murderer who had killed 2 girls in 1921, at the age of 15. He served a long prison sentence, was released in 1941, and later lived in West London under the name Harry Stevens. Researchers and a BBC documentary examined Jones as a possible suspect, pointing to his history of strangulation and body concealment, and his presence in West London during the relevant period. But the Metropolitan Police described attempts to link him to the Hammersmith murders as speculative and without evidential basis. He was not charged. So the case remains in an unsettled place. 6 women were killed. Investigators documented strangulation, bodies found stripped or nude, missing teeth in several cases, and industrial paint flecks on multiple victims. The paint evidence led police toward the Herrmann trading estate, but it did not produce a conviction. A major suspect died before arrest. A later theory remained speculative. A confession collapsed for lack of evidence. Much of the original forensic evidence is believed to have been lost or destroyed. A Scotland Yard review in 2006 and 2007 reportedly regarded the circumstantial evidence against Mungo Ireland as strong, but no charge was possible. The case was never reopened. The name Jack the Stripper has lasted because it is brief and grimly memorable. But a careful account has to keep their names present. Hannah Tailford, Irene Lockwood, Helen Barthélemy, Mary Fleming, Frances Brown, Bridget O'Hara. They lived in a city that was changing quickly, but not equally. Their deaths forced one of the largest investigations Scotland Yard had yet mounted. But that investigation did not bring a final answer. More than 60 years later, the case remains between evidence and absence. There are names. There are theories. There are locations that can still be found on a map. But the central fact has not changed. Someone knew those streets, knew those margins of the city, and knew how to disappear back into them. The question that remains is a quiet one: who was he? On a Friday night near the end of 1956, 2 sisters left their home on Chicago's South Side to see a movie they already knew well. Barbara Grimes was 15. Her younger sister, Patricia, was 12, only 3 days away from her 13th birthday. The film was Love Me Tender, starring Elvis Presley, and by some accounts they had already seen it many times before. It was the kind of small devotion that belonged to that moment in American life, when Elvis Presley was not only a singer or actor, but a presence moving through radios, magazines, record shops, theater posters, and the conversations of young people. The girls were expected home before midnight. The Brighton Theatre was not far from their neighborhood. They had a familiar destination, a familiar route, a little money for tickets, popcorn, and bus fare, and the ordinary permission of a mother allowing her daughters to enjoy one more evening during Christmas break. But Barbara and Patricia Grimes did not come home. For 25 days, their family, police, reporters, neighbors, and strangers followed every possible sign of them. Their photographs appeared in newspapers. Rumors traveled through Chicago and beyond it. The city watched a family wait. Then, on January 22, 1957, their bodies were found beside a rural road southwest of Chicago. What happened between the theater and that roadside has never been settled. Chicago in 1956 was a city of neighborhoods, parishes, factories, streetcars, bus routes, corner stores, and church bells. On the south side, daily life was often measured in blocks. A person belonged to a parish, a school, a stretch of houses. Children learned routes by repetition: the way to school, the way to church, the way to the bus stop, the way to the theater on a weekend night. The Grimes family lived in the McKinley Park and Brighton Park area, at 3634 South Damon Avenue. Their home stood in a working-class part of the city, where families made do and relied on the network of neighbors and relatives that formed around them. The household was Catholic. Barbara and Patricia were two of the children of Loretta Grimes and Joseph Grimes, who had divorced in 1951. Barbara attended Thomas Kelly High School. At 15, she was old enough to carry herself with a little independence, old enough to go out with her younger sister, old enough to be trusted with a late movie during school break. Accounts describe her as ordinary in the best and most human sense of the word: a student, a daughter, a sister, a girl with friends and the small private hopes that belong to adolescence. Patricia attended St. Maurice Catholic School. She was still 12, nearly 13. Friends remembered her as lively and close to Barbara. The sisters shared an enthusiasm for Elvis Presley, fans at a time when fandom still felt physical, records played at home, theater lines, newspaper clippings, the repeated excitement of seeing the same film one more time. Christmas had passed only 3 days earlier. Schools were closed. Children were out later than usual. On the south side, late December carried its own atmosphere. The sidewalks were dark early. Store windows glowed against the cold. Bus headlights moved through the streets. Snow and thaw, soot and slush, holiday lights and factory smoke all belonged to the same landscape. On December 28, Barbara and Patricia asked their mother for permission to go to the Brighton Theatre at 4223 South Archer Avenue to watch Love Me Tender Again. Loretta allowed it. Records and later accounts placed their departure at around 7:30 that evening. The plan was simple. They would go to the movie and return before midnight. Archer Avenue was a familiar commercial street, busy enough, lined with shops, traffic, and the ordinary evening movement of the neighborhood. Inside the theater, one of the last confirmed sightings came from Dorothy Weinert, a school friend of Patricia's. Dorothy later told investigators that she saw the sisters during the intermission, around 9:30 p.m., standing in line for popcorn. They appeared to be in good spirits. Nothing about their behavior seemed unusual. At around 9:30, Barbara and Patricia were still at the theater. They were seen by someone who knew them. They were not described as frightened. They were not described as being with strangers. The girls are believed to have stayed for the second showing. That would place their expected return at about 11:45 p.m. The house on Damon Avenue was waiting for the familiar sound of daughters coming in from the cold. At home, Loretta began to worry before midnight. She sent 17-year-old Teresa and 14-year-old Joey to the bus stop near the family home. They waited through 3 buses. Each one came and went. Barbara and Patricia were not on any of them. 2 siblings waiting in the cold, watching buses arrive, looking for familiar faces through the windows, and then returning home without them. At about 2:15 a.m. on December 29, Loretta contacted the Chicago Police Department and reported Barbara and Patricia missing. From that moment, the case entered a period of uncertainty that would last for 25 days. Investigators began collecting possible sightings. A CTA bus driver reportedly believed the girls had boarded a bus after the movie and exited near Archer and Western around 11:05 p.m. If true, that would suggest Barbara and Patricia left the theater alive and were moving through the neighborhood not long before they were expected home. But like so many details in this case, it could not be made firm enough to settle the timeline. Other witnesses reported seeing two girls who resembled Barbara and Patricia walking near 35th Street, only blocks from home. Such a sighting, if accurate, would place them close to safety. But resemblance is difficult, especially after photographs have appeared in newspapers. A winter night, two young girls, a passing glance, streetlights, distance, and memory can all reshape what a person believes they saw. There were also reports involving cars. Some witnesses described young men speaking with the girls near a dark Mercury. An anonymous letter sent to advice columnist and Landers claimed the writer had seen the sisters forced into a car and included part of a license number. Police pursued such information, as they had to. But none became conclusive evidence. The search grew quickly. It became one of the largest missing person investigations in Cook County history. Hundreds of police officers and volunteers took part. More than 15,000 flyers were distributed. Their faces became familiar across Chicago. The days after December 28 unfolded with a painful rhythm. A lead would come in, and for a short time hope would gather around it. Someone had seen two girls on a bus. Someone had seen them walking. Someone had heard that girls matching their description were in another city. Police would go, ask, compare, and often return with uncertainty rather than answers. The early response was shaped in part by a theory that the girls might have run away. Their parents rejected that idea firmly. Still, some investigators initially considered it possible. The fact that the girls admired Elvis Presley gave the press a ready-made explanation. Perhaps they had gone to Nashville or Memphis. Sightings were reported far beyond Chicago. These reports were checked, but never confirmed. On January 19, Elvis Presley issued a public appeal from Graceland. If you are good Presley fans, you'll go home and ease your mother's worries. The statement became permanently attached to the case. But Presley had no known connection to the disappearance beyond the film the sisters had attended. For the family, those weeks were a daily wait. Loretta pleaded publicly that if someone was holding her daughters, they should let the girls call her. Every ring of the telephone, every police visit, every newspaper update carried the possibility of news. It is worth pausing here and returning to what was known. Barbara and Patricia had left home on December 28. They had been seen at the theater around 9:30 p.m. They were expected home before midnight. They did not arrive. After that, the trail became a series of possible sightings, none strong enough to become certainty. At the center were two girls who had gone to a movie during Christmas break and vanished somewhere between a public theater and home. By January 22, snow had fallen and thawed in the Chicago area. That day, construction worker Leonard Prescott was driving near German Church Road, close to Devil's Creek, in what was then unincorporated Willow Springs. He saw something pale behind a guardrail. At first, he thought the shapes might be mannequins. He returned later with his wife, Marie. When Marie went closer, she realized what they had found. The forms were bodies. Police were called. The bodies were identified as Barbara and Patricia Grimes. Joseph Grimes was brought to the scene and identified his daughters. The girls were found nude and frozen, lying behind the guardrail. Their clothing was not found. Investigators documented bruising on the face and head, and minor puncture wounds on Patricia's chest. But no single wound was identified as clearly fatal. Toxicology reportedly did not show alcohol, drugs, or poison. After the bodies were identified, more than 160 officers and volunteers searched the area. Later criticism focused on the possibility that the scene had been trampled, disturbing whatever physical evidence may have been present. The girl's clothing was never recovered. No murder weapon was confirmed. No vehicle was tied conclusively to the crime. One of the most public investigative focuses was Edward Lee Bedwell, a 21-year-old drifter from Tennessee. After the bodies were found, attention turned to him because owners of a Madison Street restaurant reported seeing Bedwell with two girls they believed resembled Barbara and Patricia in the early morning of December 30th. Madison Street had a reputation as a Skid Row area. To Loretta Grimes, it made no sense that her daughters would have been there. Police took Bedwell into custody. After days of questioning, he signed a confession, saying he and another man had been with the sisters for days before beating them and leaving them near the road. For a brief time, the confession appeared to offer an answer. But almost immediately, it began to fail. Stomach content findings suggested the girls had died within hours of their last known meal, not after days. Employment records placed Bedwell at work during important parts of the timeline. Bedwell recanted, claiming he had been pressured during interrogation and had made up the story. William Cole Willingham, the man Bedwell identified as his companion, denied the girls were the Grimes sisters. By early March 1957, charges against Bedwell were dropped. He was never convicted. Another person of interest was Walter Krantz, a 53-year-old steamfitter who described himself as having psychic abilities. On January 15, 1 week before the discovery, he called police and said the girls were dead in an unincorporated area of Lyons Township. He said the information came from a dream. When the bodies were found less than a mile from the area he had described, Krantz became a serious focus. Had he truly guessed? Had he heard something? Was the dream a way of revealing knowledge without explaining its source? Police questioned him but did not find enough evidence to charge him. Max Flagg was another name in the investigation. He was 17. During an unofficial polygraph examination, he allegedly confessed. But the confession could not be used in court, and there was no physical evidence to corroborate it. Flagg was released without charges. He was later imprisoned for an unrelated murder. Charles Leroy Melquist became part of the case in later decades. Melquist was convicted of murdering 15-year-old Bonnie Lee Scott in 1958, whose body was found several miles from where Barbara and Patricia had been discovered. Retired officer Raymond Johnson, who renewed public interest in the case, considered Melquist a strong suspect, pointing to victim age, geography, and manner of body disposal. But Melquist was never charged in the deaths of Barbara and Patricia Grimes, and he died in 2010. The theory remains unproven. Bedwell offered a confession that collapsed. Krantz offered a claim too close to ignore. Flagg allegedly confessed in a context that could not carry the case. Melquist fit a later pattern but was never tied to the sisters by evidence strong enough for court. Each name represents a door investigators opened. None led to a conviction. Throughout the investigation, one central problem remained: the medical evidence did not lead to a clear, shared conclusion. The official death certificates listed the deaths as homicide by secondary shock from exposure to low temperatures. The official position was that Barbara and Patricia died from freezing after being left outside in the cold. Stomach content evidence suggested they likely died within hours of leaving the theater, and that their bodies may have remained near German Church Road for weeks, covered by snow until a thaw made them visible. But not everyone accepted that interpretation. Harry Gloss, the chief investigator for the Cook County Coroner's Office, publicly challenged the official findings. He argued that marks on the bodies showed violence before death. He suggested the girls may have been alive until early January, or that their bodies may have been placed at the site after a later snowfall. Gloss also alleged that evidence of sexual assault had been minimized or suppressed. Coroner Walter McCarran rejected Gloss's claims and accused him of overstepping. After refusing to retract his statements, Gloss was fired. Sheriff Joseph Lohman later allowed him to continue working on the case without pay, reflecting how divided the authorities had become. For a careful reading of the case, it is important to separate what was established from what was argued. It was established that Barbara and Patricia Grimes disappeared after going to the Brighton Theatre on December 28, 1956. It was established that they were seen there around 9:30 p.m. It was established that their bodies were found on January 22, 1957, near German Church Road. It was established that they were nude, frozen, and without their clothing. It was established that no single fatal wound was identified. It was established that the official cause of death involved exposure to low temperatures, and that the deaths were classified as homicide. It was not established exactly when they died. It was not established who took them or how. It was not established whether Bedwell, Krantz, Flagg, Melquist, or any other person was responsible. It was not established whether sexual assault evidence existed in the way some officials claimed. The case became difficult not because there were no leads, but because there were too many that could not be made firm. There were sightings, but they conflicted. There were confessions, but they collapsed. There were injuries, but no agreed fatal wound. There was an official cause of death, but a public challenge from inside the coroner's office. As the years passed, the Grimes sisters became part of Chicago's cold case memory. Their story stayed with the city because it began in such an ordinary way. Two sisters went to a movie during Christmas break. They were not far from home. The gap between those facts and the place where they were found is what has kept the case alive in public memory. Loretta Grimes never learned what happened to her daughters. She died in 1989. The Cook County Sheriff's Office has described the case as open, worked as leads come in. No modern DNA breakthrough has named an offender. No court has heard a completed case against a suspect. The legal outcome remains simple. Unsolved. What remains is a narrow line of confirmed events. Barbara and Patricia left home on a Friday night. They went to a theater on Archer Avenue. They were seen there by someone who knew them. They did not return by the time expected. For 25 days, the city watched and waited. On January 22, a man and his wife found them beside a road near Devil's Creek. Barbara was 15. Patricia was 12, almost 13. They were students, sisters, daughters, and ordinary young fans of a film they had already seen again and again. On December 28, 1956, they went out to watch it one more time. And after all the searches, all the statements, all the disputed findings, and all the years since, the quiet question remains. Who was the last person to see Barbara and Patricia Grimes alive?